Okay, so having looked at the Ricardian model without trade, with trade, remember we only were looking at two goods, two countries, two goods, one factor of production. We're going to keep two countries, we're going to keep one factor of production, but now we want to have a look at what happens if we look at when we look at comparative advantage with many goods, not just two, but n number of goods. It's just a short one, and we look at it from a slightly different approach. What we want to start with though is actually we actually want to look at wages now, which I haven't talked about much at all. It's been implicitly there in the other in the previous videos, but I haven't explicitly talked about wages. So I think before we begin on this issue of comparative advantage with lots of goods, with many goods, we just want to have a quick look at relative wages. So let's use the example from the previous topic. That was the Ricardian model with the trade. And I said, okay, so the relative price, remember we used the relative price of one. Remember at that price, both were specializing in their respective things, wheat and yogurt, right? Obviously, if the relative price is equal to 1, that means whatever it is, whether it's $5 or $10 or $100, the price of wheat is equal to the price of yogurt. It doesn't have to be, and we can obviously change this analysis if it's greater than or less than 1, whatever, but we'll just take this as our example here. Now remember that home could produce 1 kilo of wheat in an hour, but remember it took foreign country 6 hours to produce a kilo of wheat. So just in terms of wheat, we can say that home is six times more productive than foreign. With respect to yogurt though, home could produce, remember, a litre in 2 hours, foreign a litre in 3 hours. So here home is only 1.5 times as productive as foreign. That of course is the reason why home specialised in wheat and foreign in yogurt. However, in terms of wages, so I've used this $12 as an example, but again, as long as the price of wheat is equal to the price of yogurt, it doesn't matter what that price is, $10, $50, $100, right? Just want to look at the hourly wage, which is what we mean when we're talking about relative wages, or when we ultimately will be talking about relative wages. So the hourly wage in home is going to be $12. Remember, it's the only factor of production, so it's getting all of the income from the price of the good. But that's not its wage, that's its income. The wage is what they get per hour of work. So remember, if they're specialising in wheat, they sell wheat, how many hours does it take them to do it? It took them 1 hour. So their hourly rate was $12. The price of the good divided by how many hours it took them to produce it. In foreign, remember, well, they were specialising in yogurt, so they produced yogurt. So their hourly wage is actually going to be $4. Still $12 for the price of yogurt. But remember, it took them, where have I got it? It took them 3 hours, a person 3 hours to produce a litre of yogurt. So it's 12 divided by 3 is equal to 4. Now that's fine. So what we can see then is that home's wage is 3 times that of foreign. Yeah. So the relative wage is 3, or 12 and 4. Okay. And so that's what we're going to be looking at now. We want to talk about relative wages, the wage in home relative to the wage in foreign. And so now we can expand this analysis to trade with many goods. All right, so we're going to expand this to look at comparative advantage, still keeping two countries. So we're just going to say, well, let n equal the number of goods available, and the unit labour requirements for the ith good is simply ALI in home country and A asterisk LI in the foreign country. So it's the same principle, but before, when we only had two goods, the I was equal to wheat and yogurt, so you had LW and LY, right? But now we're expanding it to n number of goods. So as we're going to see in a sec, which country produces what goods will depend crucially on the relative wages between the two countries. So the wage rate in home divided by the wage rate in foreign. Specifically, a country is going to produce a particular good if the cost of the good is lower than in the other country. Now, what's the cost? Well, the cost is simply, let me get my little pointer out, I need a pen, is simply the wage that you have to pay the person multiplied by the unit labour requirements. Right, so that whole thing is obviously equal to the cost of the good. Yeah, what you pay them times how much time it takes them to make it. Right. So home is going to produce the good if that cost is less than the cost of the same good in the foreign country. Yeah. Or again, you can rearrange those terms and you can look at the relative productivity, the relative labour productivity with respect to this good in terms of the foreign country divided by the home country. If that relative productivity is greater than the relative wage with respect to home versus foreign. So the foreign country will produce if that relative productivity between them and the home country is less than the cost, the relative wage rate in the home country, which is fine, but maybe an example will show this a bit better. So let's have a table. So here I've got these silly goods that I've thought of. In this column here, we've got the unit labour requirements in home. So in other words, it takes 2 hours to make what would it be, a kilo of lima beans, 10 hours to produce a kilo of mint, 6 hours to produce a metre of nylon curtains, and so on. In the next column, we've got the unit labour requirements in the foreign country for the same good. You can see here it's a lot greater. So again, there's an absolute advantage for all goods except for pickles. So we've got 20 hours to make a kilo of lima beans, etc. Obviously, to get the relative productivity, this is in this last column here, it's just that divided by that divided by that. So again, it's the relative productivity that's important here. So this is the one that we're going to pay attention to. Yeah. So as long as we know what the relative wage is between the two countries, then we can tell which country is going to produce which good. Because if we know this and we know this, then we know from the previous slide who's going to produce what. So let's say, for example, and again, this is just made up, let's assume that the home wage is 6 times that of the foreign country. So in other words, the relative wage is 6. So basically, home's going to produce all the goods for which the relative wage is less than the relative productivities. So here you can see if the relative wage is 6, that's less than the relative productivity for these two goods, for lima beans and mint. If that relative wage changes, though, of course, then that changes the possibilities, at least, of which country is going to produce what. So if I change that 6 to 3, in other words, the relative wage is now only 3 times that in the foreign country, then now home is going to produce those 3 goods. In other words, lima beans, mint, and the nylon curtains. Which is fine, but what I've done is I've just sort of said, oh yeah, let's assume it's that, and let's assume it's that. But how do we come up with this number? In other words, how do we determine relative wages? And for this, we use a slightly different model. We're going to bring in the concept of a derived demand, okay, labour demand from the production of these goods and we'll use the same example to work out the relative wages, okay? So we're going to assume a perfectly inelastic supply curve. So all that says is that basically everyone works and everyone will offer their services regardless of what the wage is, right? And it doesn't vary. So in other words, as the relative wage goes up, you don't find more labour being supplied, right? So it's not an upward sloping labour supply curve. It doesn't make a massive difference, but it just simplifies things. The relative demand for labour depends on the relative productivity. So let's have we've got a diagram here. You can see on this axis here we've got the relative wage, that W on W asterisk star, and the relative quantity of labour. The quantity of labour in the home country divided by the quantity of labour in the foreign country. And then we've got this relative demand where you can see we've got lima beans, the mint, the nylon curtains, oranges, pickles. Okay. So let's assume that the relative supply curve is here, relative home versus relative to foreign labour, which is the example I had before where I said the relative wage was 6. Yeah. So the intersection of the relative supply curve and the relative demand curve is here at that 6. Okay. So given this is exactly what we had in the previous one. The home country is going to produce the lima beans and the mint, and the foreign country is going to produce the nylon curtains, oranges, and pickles. So this is sort of based on where the relative supply of labour is. Remember, we're talking here about supply, labour demand and labour supply. We're not talking about the products themselves, the demand for the products themselves. So why is it that they're producing the home country producing the lima beans and the mint? Well, because the home workers have a productivity advantage over the foreign of remember 10, was that 20 on 2, and 8 for lima beans and mint respectively, but are paid 6. Yeah. What if the relative supply curve increased? In other words, what if the home country labour supply increased? It could, of course, have that decreasing, but let's say it's an increase in the quantity of labour in the home country relative to the foreign country. Well, of course, the labour supply curve is going to shift out to the right. What that's going to do, of course, is it's going to lower the relative wage. There's more people in the home country now. Yeah. So with relatively higher labour supply and lower wage, now all of a sudden, home's also going to start producing the nylon curtains. So they get, so it's that one, that, and that. So they're going to produce all of those, and foreign will just produce these last 2, oranges and pickles. So this is just a minor thing. This is not going to be a major part of the course or anything. It's just purely looking at, the point of ultimately of looking at this is that one of the things that we can do with this is in a very simplistic way. This kind of helps explain why, the wages in, say, Eastern Europe are lower than the wages in Western Europe, but just because there is that wage discrepancy, there is that there is a relative wage advantage, if you like, between Western and Eastern Europe. That doesn't mean that therefore the cheaper country is going to produce everything. There's a reason why their relative wages are lower in Eastern Europe, because they are not as productive. And this is the argument I think the textbook gives the example of the US and Mexico. And you hear this all the time. Oh, well, of course, we're losing out to Mexico because their wages are so low and US workers' wages are so high. Well, that's true, but US workers are more productive than Mexican workers. So in other words, you cannot tell purely based on the nominal dollar value of the wage whether Mexico has a comparative advantage in this, that, or the other thing relative to the US. In other words, you can't just throw out the wage numbers and say, oh, well, that's why. You have no idea until you start talking about the relative productivities as well. That's when you can start saying something. So we use this sort of thing a little bit in that kind of context.